On September 28, 2022, the Bank of England did something that appeared to contradict itself. It announced it would purchase gilts, long-dated United Kingdom government bonds, at scale. That same week, it was raising interest rates. Buying bonds eases financial conditions. Raising rates tightens them. The Bank of England was doing both simultaneously. The question isn't why. The question is what this moment reveals about what central bank credibility actually is. It isn't a reputation, it isn't a feeling. It's a structural contract, and like any contract, it has specific clauses that can fail independently of each other. In the 2 years that followed, 3 central banks, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, and Turkey's central bank, each had that contract tested. Each broke at a different point. Each required a different kind of repair. Central bank credibility is usually described as trust. That's true, but it's not operational. Trust is the output. The input is a set of structural conditions that either hold or don't. 3 conditions determine whether a central bank's credibility is durable. The first is independence architecture, who has the authority to override the central bank, under what conditions, and whether that authority has been used. The second is commitment structure, what the central bank has explicitly promised, under what conditions it will act, and whether those conditions are verifiable. The third is market memory, how long a credibility shock persists in price signals, inflation expectations, and capital flows after the initial event. These 3 conditions can fail separately. They have different recovery timelines, and they require different institutional responses. The Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, and Turkey's central bank each failed a different one. The United Kingdom crisis of September 2022 was triggered by a fiscal event. The Truss government's growth plan, unfunded tax cuts announced September 23rd, caused a rapid repricing of United Kingdom government bonds. Gilt yields spiked. Long-dated yields moved by amounts that historically took months. The problem wasn't the yield movement itself. It was what that movement did to United Kingdom pension funds. For decades, defined benefit pension schemes had used a strategy called liability-driven investment. They held leveraged positions in long-dated gilts, using derivatives and repo to match their long-duration liabilities. The strategy assumed gilts would move gradually. When they didn't, pension funds faced collateral calls they couldn't meet. The only way to meet those calls was to sell more gilts, which pushed yields higher, which triggered more collateral calls. The feedback loop was self-reinforcing. On September 28th, the Bank of England's Financial Policy Committee assessed it as a material risk to United Kingdom financial stability. The bank intervened £19.3 billion of gilt purchases over 13 days, roughly 0.9% of gross domestic product. Here is the institutional mechanism that made this possible without damaging monetary policy credibility. The Bank of England operates with 2 structurally separate committees. The Monetary Policy Committee sets interest rates. The Financial Policy Committee manages systemic risk. These are not divisions of the same function. They are distinct bodies with distinct mandates and distinct legal authority. The gilt purchases were authorized by the Financial Policy Committee, not the Monetary Policy Committee. The Monetary Policy Committee was informed, as required by the Concordat governing their relationship. But the decision to buy gilts was a financial stability decision. Monetary policy did not own it. This distinction was operationally real. The Monetary Policy Committee continued raising rates through and after the intervention. The purchases were explicitly temporary, a 13-day backstop, and were fully unwound within 3 to 6 months. Bank of England research on the episode found that the asset purchases stabilized gilt markets without materially affecting the monetary policy stance. This was only possible, the research stated, because the intervention was temporary. Persistent purchases would have created a direct conflict between the 2 mandates. The Bank of England's credibility survived because its architecture contained the crisis before it reached the Monetary Policy Committee. There is a secondary point. The liability-driven investment vulnerability that required the intervention was itself a product of the regulatory environment the Bank of England sat within. United Kingdom pension funds built leveraged gilt positions under oversight split between the Financial Conduct Authority and the pensions regulator. The Financial Policy Committee's post-crisis response included issuing minimum resilience standards for liability-driven investment funds. The bank was closing a gap in a system it did not fully control. The monetary policy credibility held. The regulatory architecture had failed to prevent the vulnerability in the first place. Yield curve control was introduced by the Bank of Japan in September 2016. The policy was explicit: target the 10-year Japanese government bond yield at 0% and use unlimited purchases to hold it there. The mechanism was designed as a credibility anchor. An unconditional commitment, backed by unlimited central bank balance sheet capacity, should in theory be self-enforcing. If markets believe the peg will hold, they have no incentive to test it. That logic worked for several years. When global inflation arrived in 2022, it stopped. As the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank began aggressive rate hiking cycles, capital flowed away from yen assets. The yen weakened, Japanese import costs rose. Domestic inflation, which Japan had spent decades trying to generate, finally appeared. The Bank of Japan faced a choice, with no clean exit. If it maintained YCC, it had to purchase massive quantities of JGBs to defend the zero target against the market that believed the rate should be higher. Its balance sheet expanded to over 700 trillion yen, larger than Japan's entire annual economic output. Bond market functioning deteriorated, transaction volumes fell. The JGB market was being systematically absorbed by the central bank. If it abandoned YCC, it would be admitting the unconditional commitment was, in fact, conditional. Markets would interpret any movement as a signal of further movement. The exit itself would become the credibility test. This is the structural trap of an unconditional commitment device. It works through the belief that it is unconditional. Once that belief is tested, any partial exit validates the test. The bank navigated this incrementally. In December 2022, it widened the yield band from plus or minus 0.25 to plus or minus 0.5%. Markets immediately read this as a de facto policy shift. The yen strengthened overnight. The bank had not officially changed policy. Markets had already changed it. In July 2023, the band widened again to plus or minus 1.0%, and the hard cap was redesignated as a reference rate. Each step was framed as technical. Each was read as a retreat. The formal exit came in March 2024 under Governor Ueda. The Bank of Japan raised rates for the first time since 2007 and discontinued the yield curve control framework. The stated trigger was specific: wage growth. The Trade Union Confederation's interim report showed average wage increases of 5.28%, the highest since 1991. The bank had previously conditioned policy normalization on evidence of a wage-price virtuous cycle. That evidence had met the stated threshold. The institutional function of naming a specific exit condition was to convert the unconditional commitment into a conditional one and give the exit a legible, defensible trigger. The decision passed 7-2. One of the dissenters argued against ending both yield curve control and the negative interest rate policy simultaneously. What remains open is the balance sheet. The Bank of Japan's Japanese government bond holdings remain at historically extreme levels. As of late 2025, Japanese government bond yields continue reaching new highs. The exit from yield curve control normalized the commitment structure. It did not resolve the structural consequences of 8 years of unlimited purchases. The most instructive case is the one where the credibility contract was not simply tested, but deliberately broken and then rebuilt, partly, from the outside in. Between 2021 and 2023, the Turkish government eliminated the functional independence of the central bank without changing its formal status. 3 central bank governors were dismissed in succession. Each dismissal followed resistance to rate cuts that conflicted with the government's stated preference. The policy rate was cut to 8.5%. Turkish inflation reached 85.5% in October 2022. The formal independence architecture of the Central Bank of Turkey was preserved on paper. The institution existed. The governor title existed. What did not exist was the operating condition that makes independence meaningful: the capacity to make decisions without the credible threat of removal. Market memory recorded this. The lira depreciated severely. Turkish residents moved systematically into foreign currency deposits as a hedge against monetary policy they could not trust. After the May 2023 elections, a new economic management team initiated a conventional tightening cycle. The policy rate rose from 8.5 to 50% by early 2024, 41.5 percentage points over roughly 9 months. Central Bank of Turkey Governor Karahan's speech at the Bank for International Settlements in May 2024 presented specific metrics of the partial rebuilding. The country risk premium fell below 300 basis points. Net reserves, excluding swaps, increased by $34 billion. Turkish lira deposit share rose from 32 to 44% of total deposits in 8 months, and portfolio inflows into Turkish government debt held against broader emerging market outflows. These are real signals. They indicate that meaningful market credibility was restored through policy action. The International Monetary Fund's 2025 Article 4 assessment adds the constraint. As of late 2025, Turkish inflation remained at 33% against the central bank target of 24%. The International Monetary Fund found expectations poorly anchored and credibility gaps unresolved. The structural explanation for the gap is in the mechanism of loss and recovery. Credibility lost through political interference operates at the level of the independence architecture, the rule that says governors cannot be removed for policy disagreement. That rule was visibly violated. Policy actions, even aggressive ones, operate at the commitment structure level. They demonstrate what the current institution is willing to do. They do not restore the rule that was broken. The lira deposit shift and the reserve recovery show that markets responded to the new commitment. The unanchored expectations show that markets have not fully updated on the independence architecture. No formal institutional reform was made to the Central Bank of Turkey's independence framework after the 2023 pivot. The law was not changed. The appointments process was not altered. The structural risk of a future governor dismissal was held in abeyance by political choice, not removed by institutional design. Policy credibility and institutional credibility are related. They recover at different speeds. The Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, and Turkey Central Bank each faced a credibility pressure in the same short window of history. Each broke at a different structural point. The Bank of England's credibility held because its architecture separated the financial stability function from the monetary policy function before the crisis arrived. The dual mandate structure absorbed the shock without requiring either committee to compromise its mandate. The repair was structural, and it was already in place. The Bank of Japan's credibility was held in place by a commitment it had made unconditionally. It required a specific, externally legible trigger to exit that commitment without institutional face loss. The commitment structure was repaired. The balance sheet consequences of holding that commitment for 8 years remain open. Turkey's central bank rebuilt meaningful market credibility through aggressive policy action. What was not rebuilt was the institutional architecture that makes independence durable. Without formal structural reform, the credibility is policy contingent. It depends on political goodwill, the same goodwill that removed it. 3 cases, 3 mechanisms, 3 outcomes at different stages of resolution. The underlying logic is the same. Credibility is not what a central bank claims. It is the gap between what it commits to and what markets believe it will do, shaped by the architecture that protects or overrides the commitment, and the memory of how that architecture has behaved under pressure. The framework is the one you now have: independence architecture, commitment structure, market memory. The next stress test will be readable through it.